Hello and welcome to Seance, our Deathtrap tomb design stream here on the Adventure Archive. My name is Ryan, and with me, as always, we have the master of the genre himself, Sersa Victory. How you doing tonight, Sersa?
I'm doing okay. I'm excited to be back here for episode number 7. Had to double check that about traps. I apologize in advance to those who are watching or listening. My voice is a little shot. I just finished running some basic fantasy for a bunch of very loud teenagers, so I'm a little hoarse, but I'm pumped up. This is gonna be a good one.
Nice, I'm excited, dude. Traps is such a fun thing to do, but also, I mean, as someone, you who has put out like traps courses and traps books and Deathtrap dungeon stuff, this is going to be a really, really fun one. I'm excited to dig in. I also got a lot of links for this one, so I guess we'll be doing a lot of rolling, so that's exciting.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, I guess we can maybe get into a little bit of discussion before we do the exercise for tonight. So as we just mentioned, tonight we are doing traps. In previous episodes, we talked about things like iconic dungeon crawling moments, things like our dungeon theme keywords and verbs. So if this is your first time tuning in to Seance, I definitely recommend maybe going back and watching those previous episodes, since the stuff that we'll be doing tonight draws a lot on uh, the previous episodes. What I wanted to do, though, before we really dig into it, is I wanted to ask you, Ryan, about your experience with traps, either as a game master or as a player. And I'm particularly interested in your perspective because, I've been playing since middle school, so whenever the hell that was, like the 90s. And then I've been designing since about 2008. But if I remember correctly, you're somewhat more recent to the RPG scene, right?
Yeah. I read every D&D book that existed when I was younger without ever knowing that D&D was a game that I could play.
Yeah.
So I got into it in 2014 with the 5e starter set.
And the reason I asked that is because, and this is just my perspective, it seems like more recently there's been a shift away from using traps, not just in D&D in general, but even in dungeon adventures. And I remember probably a couple years ago, I went on a podcast to talk about traps and trap design, and the host before the show went to Twitter and said, "Hey, if anybody has any questions about this topic, go ahead and pop them in the thread." And there were multiple people that were basically saying straight up, "Are traps even relevant anymore? Are traps even a thing that we include, or is it just some kind of weird anachronism?" And so for me, coming into the game, I mean, pretty much in the early 90s, what drew me to D&D was the very sort of Indiana Jones nightmare, like the British TV show Nightmare trap dungeon, right? But it seems like more recently, if you're coming into the game in the last decade or so, my understanding is the vibe is you don't really do traps anymore. But what's been your perspective, Ryan, coming into the game more recently when it comes to traps?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that completely. When I first started, you know, DMing 5th edition, I was constantly looking for resources for like traps and puzzles and stuff because there fucking weren't any. Like there was, I don't think the mechanics really are designed for traps as much. Maybe puzzles, but they try to make them RP more than anything, and it's just, I mean, I would agree with that completely. I don't think that, in my opinion, a lot of the games I've played, and specifically 5e, is designed well for them, utilizes them in any way, or encourages their use. I think someone in chat just said a great thing, as Matev said. Modern mainstream thinks traps are gotcha GMing and don't have a place in the game, and I that's exactly how I feel.
Yeah, that seems to be the general gist, which again is unfortunate, since for people like me, what did draw me to games like D&D was this sort of obstacle course style Indiana Jones, delving into an underground space. Um, but I think people have very good reason to be leery of traps because I think you're right. They're not. I don't know. They're not very well well designed in most published adventures, and even looking at recent rule sets that are sort of dungeon crawl focused, traps are definitely very very sparsely designed when compared to something like monsters. So, for example, you could grab, like I just got Castles and Crusades not too long ago, one of the newer editions, and you'll get like a literal entire book of monsters and their lore and their tactics and how to use them. And then if you're lucky, the traps section will be 2 pages, and it's often some flavor of you step on a pressure plate, it shoots a dart, you take 1d6 strength damage, that kind of stuff. So it's, not at all surprising that people just don't really see a place for traps or struggle to use them very well because there's not a lot of great examples, and then you don't really get a whole lot of solid theory around traps, in my opinion. You get things like, I think I forgot where I heard about this, but like this click idea where, okay, you can make it where the players trigger the trap, but then like one of the players is stuck. It's like, okay, well, you're on the pressure plate. You can't really take your foot off yet. How are you going to get yourself out of this situation? And, that can be fun once or twice, but it's not really a broader philosophy or framework of trap design that can carry you through multiple products. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I actually used Click before and it was fun, like twice. And then like it just doesn't feel like it flows in the game, and also like the players have to get used to it as like, because you just go click and everyone just like kind of stares at you for a second and they're like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, and I will say it's like for the 5e game, I thought like Click I personally think Click was a good idea. And like I said, when I did use it and people were like accustomed to it, it was all right. Like it was enjoyable, kind of like for like once or twice, and then it just kind of goes. But as you're saying, like it's a dungeon, right? So if I'm a bad guy in a dungeon, I'm gonna have more than just some like goblins. I'm gonna have traps. So like there should be as much of a focus on traps as there is goblins. But as you said, 5th edition, which again is the mainstream right now for a lot of people, just doesn't focus on. I'll be surprised if there's even 2 pages about them in there. So yeah, completely agree.
Yeah, or even some of the more like OSR related stuff. I recently picked up a book. Admittedly, it's I think about 10 years old at this point. It was a list of dungeon hazards for Osric, and I remember reading through it and unfortunately not really enjoying it a great deal because it was a lot of the same sort of thing of you walk into a space, you have to make a saving throw, and if you fail, you take some damage, or your ability score gets reduced, or you're paralyzed. Like, really wasn't a whole lot that made me feel like, wow, I can't wait to put this into a module. So what we're going to do tonight is sort of an abridged version of my process for creating traps. It's definitely a lot more complicated than some of our previous episodes, so I do apologize in advance if a lot of information is coming real quickly. But what I want to say is where the turning point happened with me some years ago with traps was when I realized that they're actually not really any different from monsters, hazards, puzzles, and treasure, in that they all serve very similar roles in the dungeon, right? And some of those roles include, let me look at my notes here really quick, I apologize. They should create tension at dramatically appropriate moments. They should reinforce the unique theme of the dungeon, which we've talked about every episode. They should encourage iconic dungeon crawling moments, which again, we've talked about every episode. They should present hard choices or trade-offs. They should present role-playing opportunities, which we won't get into a whole lot tonight, but that's something that traps can do just the same way that puzzles and monsters and other obstacles can. And then, of course, rewarding thoughtful play or punishing poor play. So there's a lot of really interesting roles that traps play, especially when it comes to the theme and the dungeon crawling moments. And I think that's hopefully people will see that as some of the secret sauce tonight. Kind of like what we do with monsters. And I think, if you remember from last week, Ryan, how even just applying the dungeon moments to monster design really elevated the two monsters we came up with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even as we were that was the whole point. Like, as we were deciding where they were going to go and how we wanted the players to interact with them and go, like, what would make them go, oh shit. Like, I think the monsters we made pretty quickly were fucking awesome. And, pulling back in the previous 5 episodes into it, like, the moments was a huge part of pulling it in to make it feel that it fit and that it was going to be super cool.
Oh, absolutely. And invited us to create more interesting interactions beyond kind of that example stat block I made where, it's a monster and it has a slam attack and it does 1d8 damage. And then maybe it has like a poison attack that does some basic condition. And I apologize, my throat is completely sore from yelling all day. But why don't we go ahead and jump into our jam board?
Right. Kick over real quick. I think I might have the PDF up. Yep. 1 second. Let me drop that. All right. Did I actually get back to page 1? Yeah, we're good. We're on it.
Perfect. Pardon me. So one of the things that I want to start us off with is a very, very quick discussion of placing traps. Now, like I said, this will be a very abridged version of the process. I do have some future stuff planned if people want a more deep dive into trap design. But again, I'll be kind of moving through things pretty quickly. So if you're in chat, feel free to ask any questions. We can try to grab them as they come in. But, one of the really difficult things about traps is how to place them in a way that, one, doesn't feel like a gotcha. And I think you mentioned that. Or two, doesn't slow the pace to a crawl, right? And there's a couple ways that you can place traps to get around that issue. One that I want to focus on for tonight, if you want to jump to the next slide, is try to limit traps to known risky actions in the dungeon. So rather than placing traps in a dramatically uninteresting area, like a nondescript hallway or an unassuming door to some mundane room, rather think about the most dramatically interesting places in your dungeon. So things like choke points, significant doors, treasure caches, those sorts of things. And try to have your traps activate in response to a known risky action that the players are taking. It's an action they're taking where they know, okay, there's some measure of danger and uncertainty here. Because we're players, and again, I'm abridging very, very significantly, but where players get annoyed with gotcha traps is when they feel like they were misled by the game master and punished for, quote, playing the game, right? So we were walking down a hallway, or we took an action that we kind of assumed was safe, and there was no reason for us to think that we were in any particular danger. That can annoy players, right? And you see this a lot, even in modern published adventures, where there's just pit traps in the middle of boring hallways or traps on random ass doors. Like, really what you want to do is get into that Indiana Jones mindset and go, where are the dramatic things? And then what are the risky actions? So instead of walking through a hallway or that kind of thing, it's, okay, I took the chalice off the altar.
Yep.
Or, I put the gems in the demon's eyes. Like, these are actions that the players know up front are risky. And so they suspect the traps are going to be there, and when the trap goes off, they're not particularly surprised by it.
Yeah, I mean, you get to the, Matev had another point in trap, like, you don't want to provoke players in a 10-foot pole exploration. And, like, I feel like it happens and it comes up where you literally have to tell players like, listen, there's not gonna be any pit traps, don't worry about that, like, and they still want to, like, at least experienced players that have played a ton of those modules, they still are like, I poke ahead, I do this, and it's just like, guys, there's no pit trap, I promise you, I'm not trying to trick you, I know you've been tricked before, I'm not tricking you, just go, you know?
Yeah.
Like that, people have been like trained into that mindset.
Yeah, and that's definitely something, I plan to talk more about in the future. We'll hit on a couple strategies to head that off tonight. But yeah, I mean that's definitely a big issue, and a lot of that comes from what I think is often a mistaken idea that you can maximize the tension and the drama of a dungeon module by potentially having traps anywhere. Because that makes intuitive sense. Like, oh well, if a trap, if anything could be a trap, then it's just going to be super fun and tense. But unfortunately, from a game design perspective, that's often not how it plays out. What ends up happening is you cultivate very paranoid behaviors on the part of the players, and you often slow the game down to a crawl, especially if it's a game like 5th edition. It doesn't really have any risk associated with spending time or searching. If you're playing like an old school game, you have the threat of random encounters. If you're playing something like Shadow Dark, your torches are running out. Like, there's things that push against constantly searching, but in a lot of modern games, there isn't. You can just sort of search as often as you want. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is I put the word verb next to known risky action. And the reason that I've done that is because the first thing that I like to do is look at my list of theme verbs for the dungeon and use that as the basis for an interesting, dramatic, risky action that the players might take in the dungeon. And again, if this is sort of your first time watching Seance, definitely go back to episode 1 where we talk about theme keywords and theme verbs. So if you want to slide on over to the next page, you'll see here are theme verbs from episode 1, right? And what I would like for us to do is randomly pick one of these verbs.
Ooh, okay.
And we're going to use that as the basis for an interesting, dramatic, risky move that the players might make. So there are 12 verbs total. So if you have a D12 handy, give me our episode's first roll.
All right, I can have a D12 handy, and 3 clicks, boom. 9. Number 9.
So that's going to be preserve and protect.
Ooh.
So what we need to come up with now is an idea for something that the players will have to do in the dungeon adventure related to preserving something or protecting it from corrosion, and that there's some kind of risk inherent in that action, and there's a reason that the players will want to do it, right? Like maybe that's the way they get to treasure or something like that. But what's kind of coming to mind for you when we think about, okay, what's an interesting, dramatic, risky move that the players will be invited to make related to preserving or protecting from corrosion?
So are we pulling in, because I know as we've done each episode, obviously, we keep saying go listen to the old ones because all of them, pay it forward. Are we talking about ones we've already like slightly developed and now we can expand on those, or should this be brand new?
Why don't we go ahead and freestyle something brand new tonight?
Okay, because what immediately jumped into my head with the preserve protect was the wax, because we talked about that room that's gonna like weather people away if they don't do the like the wax or the reliquary or whatever. But yeah. I don't know if we talked about how they were gonna get that. So I don't know if that potentially could have been a trap on like how they're gonna get the wax. But I'm trying to think of what else we decided in the dungeon that would be different for like a preserve protect thing. That's just the first one. Because the thing with Preserve Protect is it's the only one that's different than all the rest of them.
Yeah.
Like, all the rest are like, you know, the theme, like, you know, corroding, dissolving, etching, and then we have this one that was like, let's go opposite with it. So, gosh, I don't know.
So one thing that we can do is go back to our materials list,
Mm-hmm.
which I think we have in Miro. Let me see if I can pull that up. Let me send you the link, and we can maybe go look at that and see if any ideas jump out at us.
What? Make me sign in. Give me one quick second.
Sure.
Gosh, yeah. Like I said, I'm trying to think of, because we've talked about traps throughout the whole thing, and the only one I can remember that we really discussed as protection was that one. And I'm trying to remember like even the layout that we built where there could be protection. So, you know, we could here we go. Let me bring it up over here, and let me bring it into the middle here. Boom. Okay. So, okay. So this again, like just another example of thing we've previously did that we're bringing forward once again into here. This is just like such a fun like system that we've done. Again, if this is the first time you're listening, start from episode 1 because it's going to make sense because it all builds on each other. So what I immediately think of now, I love the patina. I love, so the protective wax literally has the word protect in it. So that's why my mind went straight to that one. But now it could be the opposite, is any of these things could work and we're trying to protect against them as opposed to use them.
Absolutely. I'm looking, what am I gravitating towards here? I like patina.
I like mental deterioration too, because you could try to protect from that.
Yeah. We haven't done a whole lot with grubs or maggots yet.
I don't think
That
we've
could
done
be something
anything
that we
with the
do.
grubs or maggots.
And I wonder if that's something that we can maybe work with, is the players have to protect something important or someone important in the dungeon from being blighted by rot grubs, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's some risk involved with that.
Yeah. Let's do it. Because so we have the lichen mold fungus spider situation. That's pretty much taken care of. We have the golem. That's pretty much taken care of. We do have a section where we're going to do the protective wax. That's pretty much taken care of. Water and erosion. We've done stuff in the dungeon. I'm trying to think of. So rust we've hit on a bunch of times. Gas we've already talked about. So yeah, I feel like what we really have left a lot is patina and yeah, the grubs and maggots and mental deterioration is kind of what we have left that we really haven't like at least addressed a little bit. So fuck yeah, let's go with rot grubs.
I love it. So we don't have to get super specific about the risky action here, just enough to know like, okay, what is it that we're working with in terms of a potential trigger and hazard, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So we have, if you go back to our jam board, again, the verb that we're kind of keying off of here as the basis for the risky action that we're asking the players to take is that there's something in the dungeon. I'm picturing sort of like a Snow White type, thing, like maybe there's a preserved priestess or somebody on a slab, and there are like corrosive rot grubs or something making their way from another chamber, and okay, the players need to to preserve or protect her from those rot grubs. And there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And we can refine those details as we develop the module out. But for now, we've got our little foundation here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next thing that I want to do is jump over to the next slide in the Jamboard. And I want to talk a little bit about trap types. So what we're going to do next is come up with, or randomly generate actually, a generic type of trap. So if you can pull up for me the generic trap types random table that I sent you.
Okay, generic, that's effects, generic trap types. Okay, all right, trap type random table.
Yeah, so what we're going to do here, now that we have an idea of what the risky action is going to be, now we're going to come up with a type of trap. What is the actual mechanism of operation for this trap in the dungeon that activates when the players incorrectly or unsuccessfully try to preserve the thing, the important thing that we can work on later. So what I would like for you to do is, as you've done before on many other tables like this, throw me a D4 and a D6, and we will see what sort of generic trap type we're working with.
Okay. I got a 22, oil or acid.
Awesome. So we have a trap here that when the players unsuccessfully or incorrectly preserve, I'm just going to say, the Snow White priestess, then an oil or acid trap is going to be triggered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is often, I say this a lot in this series, this is often where a lot of dungeon design stops. Where it's, okay, it's an acid trap, and they pull out their piece of paper and they go, all right, if the players do not protect the thing, then acid sprays out DC 15 dex or take 2d6 damage, right? But one of the things that's really important in trap design is to theme the traps, to make them fit in and reinforce the unique vibe of the dungeon adventure. So what that means is taking these very generic trap types and flavoring them with the unique elements of our dungeon. So if you want to jump ahead to the Jamboard to the next slide. There are 3 different aspects of a trap that I try to theme, and that those elements are the trap's materials, its decoration, and its effect. So I'm going to step through each of these pretty quickly and explain what I mean. So materials is the actual physical stuff that the trap or its implements are made of, right? So take, for example, a swinging pendulum blade trap. And that's a pretty generic, pretty classic dungeon trap. But let's say we have a jungle-themed dungeon. What we might do here to theme its materials is say, okay, it's not just a basic iron swinging blade. Maybe it is a jaguar bone blade swinging on a knotted vine, right? Mm-hmm. We're looking at our specific dungeon theme, its aesthetic, its vibe, and going, what materials can the trap be made of that reinforce that theme so it's not just another generic swinging blade, right? So an example of this from one of my recent dungeons for Dungeon 23, the Lost Caves of the Worm Witch, the first part of the dungeon is an abandoned temple of a scorpion god. And one of the traps that I rolled was a dust trap. Now, I could have just stopped there, or it was like dust or mold. So I could have been like, okay, it's yellow mold, brown fungus, and the players have to save or die, right? It's classic, but admittedly a little bland, especially if you want to stand out in a crowded marketplace. So what I did was, okay, my trap is dust or mold, That's my material that I'm working with. That's the stuff the trap is made of. What can I do to flavor this? And after thinking about it for a while, I'm going, okay, my theme is scorpions. I changed it to the ground.
Ooh, you kind of started breaking up there, Sersa.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you're kind of getting robotic here too. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. It was right as you were saying whatever you were saying. You're like, it's like boom, and it just kind of got all robot on it.
Gotcha. Back here. So basically, with the materials in my recent adventure, I had a scorpion theme.
Mm-hmm.
That it was a dust or a mold trap, and instead of just using generic mold or dust, I said, okay, it's a scorpion themed dungeon, so the trap is actually going to be the ground up dust of sacred scorpion husks, right?
Nice, nice.
So that's material. So decoration is similar. It's another way that you can theme traps. And by decoration, I mean, what are the little sort of accoutrements that are placed on or near the trap? So these can be things like inscriptions, symbols, environmental details, not necessarily, the raw material of the trap itself, but just the way it's decorated the same way you might decorate like, a wall or a statue, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so an example of this, going back to that same dungeon, I could have just had holes in the wall. All right, that's again a classic option. But what I wanted to do was really drive home the theme of the trap. That's what we're doing here, and reinforce the theme of the dungeon. So instead, the ground up scorpion dust actually shoots out of these brass plates set in the wall of scorpion priestesses holding their hands up and casting insect plague.
Nice.
And so you can see that it's, again, reinforcing of the dungeon, making the trap a bit more memorable. Finally, effect, theming the actual harmful effect of the trap with the theme of the dungeon. That's something that we'll come back to later in this episode, but it follows a similar pattern, which is, how do we take a very basic, trap type like mold or dust, which often, in published adventures is like, okay, make a DC con save, or, take disadvantage on saving throws. Instead, it's okay, what's the unique theme of my dungeon and what can I do with the effect? So to use my Lost Caves of the Wormwitch example once again, when the player succumbs to the dust and inhales it, I thought, okay, well, it's a religious dungeon. It's like a sacred scorpion temple. There's prayer, there's chanting, there's kneeling. What can I do with this? This is my unique theme. And so the way it works is, and people actually call this trap out as being particularly fun, they're excited about it, is that when the players inhale the dust, she has to name a violent verb that starts with the letter S. And I picked S for scorpion, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happens is the first time they encounter one of the sacred scorpion enemies, like the man scorpion skeleton or the women scorpion, like zombie priestess, the ground up scorpion dust in their chest starts to move on its own accord, and the player involuntarily falls to her knees, throws her hands to the skies, and goes, "Oh, great scorpion of Kemet," and then, verb us, like skewer us, or, you know what I mean? And then depending on the verb they picked, there's a different effect that the trap has. So again, like, I took it from this potentially basic, just roll a saving throw, to, okay, I've got this like prayer, religious scorpion god theme. Let's work that into the actual effect.
Yeah, and the first thing that I ever ran of yours was Necropolis of the Mailed Fist, right? That's how we became friends, back in the day at this point. And when reading that and playing that, this style of trap in it is one of the things that made me go, like, first of all, A, this is fucking awesome, but B, that this is how it should be done. Like, this is, if you're gonna run 5e, this is making 5e fun and interesting. It's not exactly as you said. It's not like you step on it, oh well, you lose some HP, maybe, yeah, you have disadvantage on something, and that's it. That everything falls back to this very generic, very played out, like very small mechanical gotcha, and then you just move on, like, oh, you triggered it, now keep going kind of thing. And then all of the traps that you had in Acropolis were exactly like you're saying. Like, it's not just, oh, you lose a stat or you did that. There's like, bring a little RP into it, like make it come back to bite you again later, like do all of this like fun, interesting stuff with these really evocative traps. You know, that's like the, you know, like I said, that's the core of, you know, how I even got to know you. And it's still obviously applicable, you know, going forward and doing this again and getting to sit down and do the process. Like, this is what makes traps fun, and that is what made me fall in love with traps a while ago, which was your process. So,
You know, one of the things too that I want to call out with this trap theming process is it addresses, I think, a common complaint with traps in games like D&D is that they feel out of place or illogical or something like that. Like, you know, I'm not personally a big person who personally someone who cares a whole lot about logic or realism, but I'm a really big believer in the traps should feel like they belong in the dungeon, that they, you know, they reinforce the theme, they fit the vibe, that everything, you know, from monsters, hazards, puzzles, and traps create a coherent flavor, a coherent experience. And so I think if you've struggled in the past to make traps feel like they're a, and I'm putting in air quotes, natural part of the dungeon, theming traps can definitely make, can go a long way. So what I would like to do is we're going to apply this process to the generic trap type that we just rolled. So, you know, we're not just gonna do oil or acid and it just sprays out and does some stuff. We want to use our materials, decoration, and effect to theme this otherwise bland trap. So why don't we start with materials? Again, this is the physical stuff that the trap is made of. So in this case, do you want to go with oil or acid? What are you feeling first?
acid. I mean, I think acid just like it continues. It was already on our materials list. Like, I feel like it's what fits the theme of the dungeon. I feel like if we're gonna, you know, since we made all these themes and materials and stuff before, we should use, you know, we should keep enforcing it. So I feel like acid is the better move.
I love it. So what I'm picturing here, and again, we can always refine this. I'm just kind of using it as an example, but you know, we have a chamber. There's rot grubs making their way to this Snow White priestess type thing. The players screw up in trying to preserve her body against the rot grubs, and that triggers this acid trap. Now, you know, what I like to say to myself when I'm doing trap theming is it's never just something. Like, well, it's not just acid. You know what I mean? Because that's kind of dull. So why don't let's you know, gussy this up a little bit. So what can we do to elevate this acid a little bit? It's not just acid. There's something special about it. It has a special origin. Maybe the acid comes from somewhere that's interesting. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on what we might do to make this not just your everyday run-of-the-mill flesh peeling acid?
My thought is, well, I guess it comes down to what it's used for, or like why we're having it. Because what jumps into my head is that it's kind of like what you said. Like, it's going to destroy. We have to stop it, or it's going to destroy something. Like, it's not necessarily the primary component, I guess, of the trap. Like, I feel like we're stopping something to do something, right? Like you said, like maybe so it doesn't like destroy the priestess or whatever. But what if, I mean, since acid is a big part of this, what if it comes from something earlier in the game? So like, didn't we have a creature that spews acid? Was it one of like the skeleton knights or something?
Yeah, I think we had a skeleton knight that breathes like corrosive acid, and it also etches. It etched like symbols on the armor of the dead. So if it kills you, there's some symbol that gets etched. So we
Mm-hmm.
could have some kind of like, it's not just regular acid, but it's this like sacred etching acid that's only used to etch the armor of death. You know what I mean? Like just something like that.
Yeah. Well, my thought was like, so we have if they've already encountered that, they know this skeleton thing spews this acid. I love the idea of it being some type of like sacred acid etching. But what if, and maybe this isn't even specifically, maybe this is more decoration, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but what if the acid's even coming out of like Death Knight skeleton, like skulls that have been like put out? I guess it is decoration then, as like decorative above or beyond something. So it's just like, it's kind of like the Death Knight you faced before, but it's just like their skulls with open mouths like dripping it, and they're gonna be like, oh shit, we've actually seen like this before. It could even have like the same helmet or something, but instead of fighting one, there's like just the heads of like 10 of them, and then
Oh,
they'll
that
know
rules.
that it's like they might then know that it's the acid, the sacred, etching acid or whatever, because it's the skulls of creatures they fought before.
I love it. And that actually foreshadows something we'll talk about later in this episode. Glad you said that. But
So
that's good. Yeah, I love that for decoration. That's also terrifying to come into like a circular chamber and just see 10, maybe even dozens or like 100 of of these same helmets and be like, oh, what is
oh
this?
my god, dude, what, like, it could almost be like an ossuary dome, and
Yeah.
like it's just, maybe not all skulls, but like lots of them, especially right in the middle in a circle. And you could have like a drop, come like from every now and then, like, especially when you first walk in, you see like, oh, you look up, you see the skulls, and you see like, some liquid pooling on like the teeth of one, and as it lands, it like and like etches something into the floor or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just kind of Googling around here to find synonyms for acid and some other little details about it. And one thing I can't believe I forgot about this because I love using it is bile. And so something that came to mind
Mm.
for me was that the acid is actually the preserved bile of the corroded goddess when she was immortal, and they like
Oh,
extracted her bile, and that becomes the acid.
biliary juices.
There you go. And
All
that
right.
again, that kind of reinforces the theme because it's like,
Yeah.
she was the corroded goddess, and what would be sacred to them, like bile. And I think that's the substance in blasphemous, the Estus flasks or biliary flasks. So
Yeah. 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 Well, bile is fucking gross. I do get to deal with that at work. I mean, it doesn't bother me, but it is gross. But like, yeah, it's and not only that. So like, we have these skeletons earlier that are spewing it. So now we can say that that is bile
oh
because
yeah,
it's literally coming from inside them, right? So like,
oh
it's
that's
almost
so
as if
cool.
they've like consumed, because also it's a fucking skeleton. Where is bile coming from, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it comes from your stomach. Well, I mean, not really, but like it comes up out of your throat. So yeah,
And
goddess
that's
bile.
something that I definitely recommend that people do as they're designing their dungeon is don't be afraid to go back to something that you designed previously if you get like a cool idea and then update it, kind of like what we just did. Like, oh shit, let's go back to that monster and change sort of its flavor a little bit.
Mhm.
um, and you can see here, we'll do effect here in a second, but I mean, just by theming the materials and this decoration, I mean, hopefully you can see how we've elevated what in a lot of dungeon adventures is literally like some holes in the wall and it sprays acid to, oh, we have a trap where it's there are bile breathing night heads, 100 of them, ossuary selves, and when they
Mhm.
trigger the trap, visors open and it sprays out the literal collected preserved bile of the goddess. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
come on, people. So the last thing that we want to theme is the trap's effect. But before we can do that, we need to figure out what the trap's effect actually is.
Right. I feel.
So
I don't
go
know.
ahead.
Should we?
Oh, sorry.
So I feel like we've kind of got away from the rot grub thing a little bit, but I feel like that's okay. Do we still want to try to incorporate the rot grubs, or are we just going to have it more like a, since acid was a material that was also on our list, but it's also potentially a trap effect, do we just want to like double down on that, or do we want to somehow bring the rot grubs into this as well?
We can keep the rot grubs in our back pocket because again, the rot grubs aren't really the trap. They're part of the risky action that the players are going to take. Now we may have an opportunity to bring them in, but really the focus of the trap is this acid stuff.
Okay. All right.
So now what we want to do, if you want to jump over to the next slide in the Jamboard, a question that I have had a lot of people ask me, or when I would go on podcasts in the past and people would submit these questions, is how do you come up with interesting trap effects beyond just damage and death, right? And again, I think this is a problem of not having a lot of really great examples, even more recent dungeon delving games. I mean, I bought 4 different tabletop dungeon crawling RPGs over the past year, and literally every single one had maybe 2 pages of traps, and they were all some flavor of, make a saving throw or take 1d6 damage or lose 1d6 strength. And I think when people see that, compared especially to all of the guidance for monsters or role-playing or world building, it's easy to look at traps and be like, well, I guess that's what they are. And that results in, things like what are called hit point tax traps, where players just feel like you just pay the hit point tax to make your way through the dungeon. There's not really anything interesting going on. But what I want to do here is show that there is, in fact, another way. And especially if we lean on our iconic dungeon crawling moments that we've talked about in a previous episode, where we can come up with a really engaging interaction for the players that reinforces the theme, that hooks into one of the fun aspects of the dungeon crawl genre, and does something a bit more interesting than just dealing damage. So if you could, for me, throw up the generic trap effects table.
Generic, that's trap type. Generic trap effects table, okay. All right.
So this is another one of these tables that I have put together. And this is a list of 24 different effects that a trap might have, a harmful effect. And either you can roll it, or maybe we can bring chat in and they can roll. But let's go ahead and generate our generic effect for this trap.
Okay. How many more dice rolls are we gonna have tonight?
A lot.
Okay, well then I'll just keep rolling for a little bit just to. Okay. I got looks like a 23. Make a puzzle's key item dangerous to take or carry.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is one of the generic trap effects that I have on this list here, which is the trap makes a puzzle's key item. It could be a literal key, or it could be just something that the players need to solve a puzzle elsewhere. And the effect of this acid makes that key item dangerous to take if the players don't already have it, or carry if they already are carrying, right? So how do you feel about that? Do you want to proceed with that one, or do you want to roll again?
I think it's actually perfect. I really love that one because we've already like the bones that they're carrying are already things that we gave them kind of for this purpose. It's just like you have to put them back. We've they're already risking it for some other things. I love the idea of this specifically for that. So it could either be I have 2 things popped into my head right away. One was the bones, right? Make a puzzle's key item dangerous to take or carry. 2 things. One, if they've lost a bone, it could be like a possibility to take it back, but at a risk. Or 2, a risk of losing another bone, or 3, it could be, what if when they deposited the bones they got something else, and then this would make that more dangerous, as in, like, if they're trying to put 4 bones back, maybe, like, you know, when they put 1 back, that's cool. When they put 2 back, that's cool. But when they try to put the 3rd one back, like, they've already got, like, whatever token for putting it back. This one, you don't just get the token, it's dangerous to carry the token. Those are the 3 things that first popped into my head. What were you thinking?
Yeah. You know, I like that, and I kind of zeroed in on the bones, which is for those who are new. We talked about that in, I think, episode 2, which was the unique mechanic. Yes, episode 2. And so we have these papercraft skeletons that the players are trying to assemble and return to the appropriate sarcophagi. And I like the idea of doing something that makes them dangerous, I guess dangerous to carry since they already have them. Mm-hmm. But we're not done yet. So if you go back to the Jamboard, you see that I have the effect combined with a moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to jump over to a table that we've used a number of times in the series, which is the random dungeon moment table. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this effect that we've come up with, which is we have this vial of the goddess. It sprays out of all of these, Death Knight helmets, hits the bones and does something with them to make them dangerous to carry. But we're going to cut that with a moment. So if you want to go ahead and roll on this table, we'll see what kind of iconic dungeon crawling moment we want to encourage with this effect.
I got a 2 and a 6, so it looks like that is an oh no moment.
Oh, hell yeah. So an oh no moment is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, where the players are confronted with something that is very clearly bad news, but they don't totally understand how yet. And honestly, I think I just mentioned that that's kind of what we already did with the way we've set up the decoration, which is they come into this room and they just see hundreds of helmets of this super powerful monster they already had to struggle with earlier, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I feel like we kind of got that nailed in here. That's awesome. That worked out.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is we've got our make a puzzles key item dangerous to take or carry. So in what specific way, and I'm thinking about what we've done in the past with this bile acid stuff where it etches. So my mind is immediately going to, okay, it sprays in the chamber and then it etches something on the bone, or it, like, follow me on this one. This is getting pretty wild, but what I'm thinking is it creates this ongoing deterioration of the bones. Mm-hmm. And as time goes on in the dungeon, the bones dissolve to the point where it exposes the marrow, and the marrow is like animated in marrow ooze or something.
Okay.
Like I'm just kind of freestyling it, but that's kind of the direction I'm heading. Is that okay? We're making the key item, these bones, dangerous to carry because they've been exposed to the acid, to the bile.
Okay. So I'm thinking, gosh, so how many? I feel like every like kind of loop-de-loop we did has a sarcophagus in it, right?
Yeah, we have the 2 main wings of the dungeon, and each one has like one of the sarcophagi the players are looking for, in which they're going to return the bones.
Right. So how many? So how many sarcophagus were we going to do? Because I know we only have 2 loops, but I think were we talking about potentially having like a 3rd one right as basically like the entrance to like the bad guy area, or did we want to have my thought was 4 bones that we were giving them from the beginning? So yeah. I guess my question for this with the bones is, how many are we going to make them like risk but also be able to like deposit if they want. So I feel like they have 4 bones. We have 2 sarcophagus revealed so far, with the possibility of risking one with the sarcophagolem.
Yeah.
So that's two bones right there. So are we going to try to have them risk all 4, or are they just risking like a couple, but they're going to get away with a couple because there's just not that many sarcophagi?
Yeah, I mean, we could do it that way. I'm a big fan of having, like, let's say they have fewer sarcophagi than they have bones, which forces a hard trade-off of like, okay,
That,
well, we can't deposit every bone, so which
right.
one do we want to return?
That's my thought. And then, so they can't deposit them all, but they might be able to, they might risk them all. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
they could theoretically, so if we only have 2 sarcophaguses, but there's like 2 other spots where they could risk losing a bone, I feel like the protective wax room that we still have to do at one point is one of them. And I feel like this would be the 4th one.
Yeah.
So would this trap, would we, where my head is going is this going to be an early trap or a late trap? Because if it's dangerous to carry, do we want it to be that they carry it for the most of the dungeon, or do we want to be that they carry it kind of like for the final third? Is where my head went.
Yeah. I mean, when you have something like this where you make a key item dangerous to carry, it's better to put it towards the beginning just because you have more opportunities for the players to sweat over that, you know.
That was my thought. Is the other thing too, though, then is, and again, maybe I'm like going too far, too deep outside of like the exercise and thinking about the dungeon a little more, is would the protective wax that we're going to have at some point stop this effect, or would this be regardless of that?
So it could. There's something later in this exercise that we may be able to bring that back in. I think for now, we should try to work out in what way do the bones become dangerous to carry on the back of Jerry the Trap. It's good. I mean, you're hitting a lot of the highlights that we'll touch on later. So you're very prescient. You're seeing the future. So you're on the right track. Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, my ADHD is just tangenting a little bit. I love the idea of them somehow needing to deposit the bone, and then they know it's a fucking super powerful item, right? Yeah. So something happening where the acid would etch something on the bone. I loved that. And then yeah, I like the marrow becoming something, but I also am curious of just like what did we do with the original acid etching from the knight?
So the way that worked, let me pull up my notes really quickly. When a character was slain by that breath attack with the bile, a symbol got etched on their armor if they were wearing heavy armor. Let me see. We have so many things here in our notes. The sigil has a buffing room for the knight. Oh, so basically if your game system has like symbol spells, you randomize them to spells, or you have a table that you roll on. Oh, because we had randomization as part of this one. It was like a random effect. So yeah, so basically it burns a random like symbol spell. So like symbol of pain, symbol of confusion, that kind of stuff.
Gosh, what if it was something like it etches onto the bone, and then whoever's carrying the bone, like we bring back like the rune thing? Because if it's the same bile and the same bad guy, what if we just like kind of refigure it into a different way? So instead of like etching it on one of them, what if it's just like whoever is carrying the bone, it etches like another symbol on them? So for like that one person specifically, like everything gets more dangerous, but then they might like have to pass the bone to like pass the danger around or something.
Oh, like a bone relay.
Yeah, like literally, yeah, like everything sucks more for you when you're carrying the bone. So like that would allow them all to move forward with the bone, but
Yeah.
put whoever specifically is at risk, and they have to like constantly think of like, shit, my HP is lower, shit, whatever. Like, who wants to carry the bone instead this time or whatever. I also, and this is something that we can like rewind to in the future. My thought was with the protective wax, also some type of like potential reliquary where they could deposit a bone that they could hold it safely. So that might be something we could allow them to potentially find later, where maybe the reliquary would actually neutralize the effect while they're carrying in it, but it would be a pain in the ass to get the reliquary. But that's a future thing.
Oh
But
yeah.
how do you feel about Rune of Ruin Bone Relay?
See, this is why I love this process. You come up with truly wild shit. Yeah, I love it, and it hits on something that we've talked about in previous episodes, which is that the trap presents a hard choice or a hard trade-off to the characters, and that was, one of the roles of traps that I called out at the beginning of this episode. Right, a good trap presents the characters with a tough choice or trade-off. I'm looking here at like the list of spells, the symbol spells from like the third edition players. And there's like death, discord, fear, hopelessness, insanity, pain, persuasion, sleep, and stunning. So those are all the symbol spells that exist in at least this version of D&D. So yeah, you could even have the same randomization table,
Well, that's my thought is like if we have the randomization table from earlier, basically every time they pass the bone, someone has to roll on the table again.
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah.
And it actually gives them a new rune, which, people in the chat were saying like whoever's holding it, like at the time their AC is lowered, or while they're holding it, their max HP is lowered. We could always incorporate, some if we want to do mechanical stuff into that rune table, because we still have to build that rune table. But like, what if every time you pass the bone to someone, they have to re-roll on the table? So it's not just like, oh, you take the lowered AC this time. Oh, you take the lowered AC this time. Every time they take it, it's a new rune, so they never know what to kind of prepare for.
Yeah, and it also creates a sort of risk versus reward choice, which is one of several choice types in games. Because I'm looking at the list here, there's some of these symbols are not as harsh as the others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's like symbol of pain, which it looks like imposes like penalty on attack rolls and dexterity. But then there's straight up symbol of death. And so I'm picturing a situation where it's like, okay, let's say every rest they have to choose to pass or the symbol changes, right? And they go, okay, do I want to hold on to this? Right now I'm holding bone and it's got a symbol of discord on it. So it's causing confusion among the party at certain points. Do I want to keep holding on to the bone and being confused in battle? Or do I want to hand it off to another player? And potentially they might roll a less horrible symbol, or they might roll symbol of death and die. You know what I mean? So it creates an interesting risk-reward kind of interaction. Again, a tough choice.
I love this. This is so good. Now the question is, this is an effect if they fuck up a trap, right? So theoretically, we could build this whole thing out, and then they just go, oh, we beat the trap. Or is this the trap in and of itself? Like, what we still have to have them like solve the trap, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is the effect of if they screw up. And that's the thing with dungeon design, is that you may design interesting things that the players don't encounter. Like it's certainly possible for the players in Dungeon 23 module to successfully avoid. It's like a weight pressure trap. They might successfully avoid this super cool scorpion dust thing. And that's just the way it goes. And it's the same with, secret areas or different paths. Like you may design areas the players never reach. And I think that's kind of part of the process of being a dungeon designer, but also kind of not just as a GM, because you never know what path the players are going to take and what they will see and what they won't see. You play to find out what happens. But also as a player, like, one of the reasons I love the games so much, or Elden Ring, is that there is so much of the game that you do not have to see and could very easily miss, like entire secret worlds. You know what I mean? And that really, you might think, oh, it's a waste, but like, no, it really creates a sense of like wonder and mystery because like I've legitimately, especially some parts in Dark Souls where you're so off the beaten path, I think to myself, do the game's developers even know this is here? You know what I mean? Like you just feel so off the beaten path.
Well, that's also, especially when you're prepping games that require a lot more prep, there's times where I throw shit in that they're never going to find, but it's fun for me to make because that's just it's just a fun process to do, which is exactly what this is. This is so much fucking fun. If they don't trigger this, okay, but making this has been super fucking fun. So I love always having like, you know, even if they like loot a body, there's something more that they're never gonna find because they're never really gonna like check the rectum, right? Or like, you know, or exactly like a room that you're never gonna find. I mean, again, you know, if you play Necropolis, there's shit you're not gonna fucking find in there. Like I read it, so I know it, but there's stuff you're not gonna find. But if you do, it's just so fucking cool. So yeah, so this is totally, you know, I mean, and we can also, you know, this not as a gotcha trap, and maybe tell me if I'm on the wrong mindset here. We could make it where it's more likely that they're going to, you know, but that's just their choice if they choose to do it. Because like, what if this was literally just like, okay, this looks like a spot where we put the bone. Like that's a trap. Like that's, if I was a bad guy, that's the kind of trap I would put. It would literally be like, this looks like what you're supposed to do. Okay, let's do it without really critically thinking about what's going to happen. And then boom, you know, you have the effect of it. You know, I wouldn't constantly say like, here's a super obvious trap, good guys, like keep going, you know?
Well, that's something we will be talking about towards the end of this episode. So I'm excited about that.
Look at this.
Yeah, you're just, you're predicting the future here. You know, one of the last things I'll say too, before we move on is I'm a big believer, whether it's dungeon design or when I'm writing fiction or doing like game dev, like programming, is that everything is practice. Like there's no such thing as wasted design or wasted words or wasted code. Like, you know, like you said, even if the players never see this particular trap, that was still practice for you. It's still helping you sharpen your craft. And I guess if you really wanted to, if you were like a GM, you could always recycle stuff that you don't use that the players are never going to come back to. You know what I mean? Like I've done that in the past where if players don't see something, I might, you know, work it into my next adventure. But yeah, I mean, everything you do is practice. That's the way I see my modules too, is like they're all just practice sessions. You know, it's just a way for me to work. There's no such thing as a perfect module. You're just kind of doing what you can. So I definitely say that if people are a little leery about spending time on it, is you're honing your design skills regardless of whether or not the players actually encounter. So what I would like to do is jump back to the jam board. So we have kind of an interesting effect. We've done our theming. It's feeling really flavorful. It's fitting in with the vibe, the aesthetic of the dungeon. But one of the things that I'm sure you've probably heard people talk about, maybe you yourself have engaged in this discussion, is whether or not you should hide a trap. Is this something you've ever talked about with anybody?
I don't. Maybe in passing, not like a, you know, like a sit down in-depth discussion, really.
Gotcha. Well, that's something that I have seen a lot of people talk about, which is, you know, are hidden traps good? Are they bad? What do you do with it? And I had sort of a breakthrough with it recently when I was reading a blog post by Dr. Joris Dormans again, right? The person who came up with cyclic dungeon generation for his roguelike that I adapted to tabletop. And not too long ago, he had a post on his blog talking about the elements of a trap. And if you want to jump to the next slide in the Jamboard, what he invites us to do when designing traps and kind of the approach that he's been taking with his roguelike is that the question of whether or not to hide a trap is kind of misleading, because in his mind, a trap is actually two discrete elements: the trap's trigger and the trap's hazard. And what he recommends is that you have one visible and you hide the other element, but avoid trying to hide both of them. So in reality, there's not really a trap that's completely hidden or completely visible. Rather, you have these two discrete elements, the trigger and the hazard, and you hide one, but the other is visible. So what that results in is interesting kind of dramatic play experiences. So if the trigger is visible but the hazard isn't, a really basic example of that is the trap that I just talked about from the Scorpion dungeon, where when the players enter, it says straight up, it's obvious to the players that this idol that they take is on a weight sensitive plate. So they know straight up, okay, there's clearly a trap here, and the interaction goes from, again, that slowing to the game to the crawl, let me roll perception, let me tap with my 10-foot pole, to, okay, how do we deal with this problem? We have an idol that we want, it's on a weight sensitive plate. What do we do about this? What are our options? They don't know what the hazard is, so you still have an element of the trap that is unknown, so you still have that tension, that drama, but you're not, again, having this situation where the trap is entirely, and then if it's discovered, it's not that interesting, or or it just smacks the players out of nowhere, so they don't even get to feel the fun. Like it's as Yoris writes in his blog, the interaction is over before it began. You know what I mean? You're just like, oh shit, I just got blasted with fire.
Right.
Now, likewise, if the hazard is visible, it creates a similar but somewhat different play experience where the players go, okay, we know that here, we know that this is very dangerous, but we don't specifically know what triggers the trap. So again, it's kind of similar. Like, it's not that they don't know the trap is there, it's with it. How do we move through this chamber? What elements do we think could potentially be the trigger for this trap, right?
Right.
And if you go to the next slide, I did include the link to the blog. It's ludomotion.com. That is Yoris's blog. So November 22. So that's pretty recent. I definitely recommend people check that out. That really sort of blew my mind when I read it, started adapting it to the tabletop. So what we're going to do here now is determine which of the trap elements that we're going to make visible and which one we're going to make hidden. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the different attributes. So in the blog post I here, Yoris talks about a number of different attributes of a trigger and attributes of a hazard and how they can function. So go ahead and pull up the generic trap elements table.
Generic trap. I got trap elements random table?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So I have here a table that I made with a couple different categories that relate to the different attributes that Yoris talks about in the blog post. You can see here the very first one is visibility. So trigger visible, hazard invisible, or the opposite. Now, before we roll on this, I kind of feel like we maybe already have.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the hazard is clearly visible. It's all those fucking dripping skeletons.
Exactly right.
Like, yeah.
So we've got definitely a hazard visible. A choice that we can make now is, do we want to have the trigger be invisible, or should the trigger be visible? Should it be visible or should it be invisible? I'm thinking, and I don't often do this, but I think in this case, the players would probably know what the trigger is too. It's the preserving of the body incorrectly, right? Like they know that they have to preserve or protect this body from these rot grubs. But I want to get your feeling on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes back to like, what if are we still going to use the rot grubs? Or my thought was, if in the super basic part was, they actually are trying to deposit the bone where they think it goes, and then but when they deposit it, the acid comes out. But I don't know if that feels too much like a gotcha, like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do, but in fact here is a trap. But basically almost like a Indiana Jones with like the gold, the thing that triggers the boulder kind of situation, where it's literally just like, here's like a little dais or something like that, stick the bone in it, or even if it's like sarcophagus, they stick the bone in, and that triggers it instead. But if we're going back to the rot grub situation, my only thought is, if we do the body with the rot grub, how are we going to get the acid on the bone? And that's why I thought having to put the bone into something, and then that puts the bone at risk, was what the trigger was going to be. What are you thinking?
Well, the players are carrying the bones with them, and so when when they're sprayed by all the faces, the bones are also going to be sprayed as well, and their saving throw determines whether or not they're able to successfully avoid the bones from being etched.
Right.
And so, yeah, the timeline that I have in my head for the way this major trap works is that there's this risky action the players have to take. There's this chamber with all the helmets. There's the Snow White priestess type thing in the middle of the room. They know they have to protect her from the rot grubs, and if they do so incorrectly, they have a pretty strong suspicion that those faces are going to cause problems for them. If they do screw it up, the faces spray all the bile, it gets on the bones, and now they have this bone relay situation that, stays with them until they can successfully get rid of those bones in the sarcophagi.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. I guess my question is, so we have the two NPCs in the beginning. Would this be like another priestess, we think, or would this be like a rando from like the town or something, where they were like, hired to go in, or like who would the Snow White priestess be, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we can refine that later.
Okay.
We can kind of bracket that. What I'd like to focus on now is kind of specifically what we want to do with visibility. I mean, it sounds like because of the situation we have set up, it seems like both the trigger and the hazard will be visible with 5 here.
Yeah. I think both are visible, and it really comes down to how they respond, because I think I think they're going to feel like they have to do it regardless.
Yeah. So one of the things too that I have on here, and this comes from Yoris's blog post, are location and timing for a trap's effect, right? I have a couple different options here. Things like same area immediate effect, same area delayed effect, same area ongoing effect. So delayed means there's some number of rounds before the trap hazard actually appears. So they trigger the trap, and it could be 1, 2, 3, however many rounds until the trap actually goes off. Ongoing effect means it's not a one and done thing. It's like the trap continues to spew its harmful effect. And then the other options, for the benefit people who are listening but not watching: different area immediate effect, different area delayed effect, different area ongoing effect. Now, based on what we've come up with so far, I think we've kind of got it. We're going to be going with same area, right?
Yep. That's what I feel like, yeah.
But one of the things that we can potentially play with here, we right now in our imagination, sort of an immediate effect, they screw up trying to preserve the body of this priestess on the slab, and then just the things open up and spray out. But potentially, we could have it be a delayed effect. So there's a number of rounds before the actual acid begins to shoot. So I'm picturing like they screw up, and then the visor's open, but then there's like a round or two before it actually goes off, right? Or it could be an ongoing effect, which means it keeps spraying, and potentially, this is maybe we can work in different area here. Maybe there are other helmets, these night helmets in other parts of the dungeon, and when they trigger this trap, now it's like a permanent constant spray of bile, not just here, but in other parts of the dungeon as well.
Well, I mean, so we already kind of used this a little bit with the ash water having different layers or levels. because if it just turns on, then it could, instead of like activating knights elsewhere, what if it's just a constant stream of bile that they have to like cross later because it's like dripping from other areas or like filling stuff up? You know what I mean? Like, what if they have to go into a room below it and acid is like dripping from the ceiling?
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah,
Or
I
what
love
if
I love
there's
that
even,
verticality.
what if there's even like, you know, classic like vampire bleeding a person, like tubing shit on the ground, that when the acid hits the ground, it actually, they can see it funnel out into um like, you know, aqueduct style stuff out of the room, so the room doesn't fill up with that acid, but then they see later that it's all this like plumbing or something that runs the acid throughout the rest of the dungeon or something, you know, that if they hadn't triggered it, they wouldn't have been activated by it. You know, like it could just basically turn on a faucet that is now, you know, spraying it all over the place because it doesn't stop pouring out of this room.
I love it, and that even creates an opportunity to foreshadow the trap, and actually goes back to the oh no moment. Again, to remind people, the oh no moment is basically I see something, I know it's not good, I don't exactly know how it's going to screw us yet, but I know it will, and it's named that because there's one particular player in my local where uh, every other room, that's her reaction is oh no. Just like what
Nice.
fresh hell is this? And so we can foreshadow it by the players see the channels in the ground in previous rooms, and they're like, okay, what is this shit? Like, what's going to happen here? What goes in there?
Or oh, they could even have like you know how like fountains with like open mouths and shit like that
Ooh,
in
yeah.
various areas, you know, like I imagine, like, you know, two things that pop in my head is like the lady pouring the thing, and then also like the cherub being, like those kind of situations where they're like, why is this open mouth just like on the wall? There is like decoration, and then when they
Yeah.
get to a later room afterwards, that open mouth will be pouring out acid that now causes shit they have to deal with for the rest of the dungeon too.
Yeah. And again, they go, oh no, this is what the
Yep.
faces were all about in the previous rooms.
Yep.
Like, we are so screwed.
So
So,
I like the, so it's a little bit of both, right? It's same area, immediate effect, and ongoing effect.
absolutely. And in different areas too. And like, this is sort of a distillation of the different attributes that Yoris talks about in his blog post. There's a lot of them that he describes, like the different ways that you can design both a trigger and a hazard. And, you know, this is one of those ways. Like, what area does it affect? Is it immediate? Is there a delay? Is it ongoing? Can it be reversed? And we've sort of, you know, we didn't really roll on this one yet because we kind of had an idea already. But yeah, that's kind of what we would do. I want to jump down to avoidability. We'll come back to avoidability. This is something that you talked about earlier, and this is a way to get around some of that gotcha trap stuff, because one of the ways that a trap can be perceived by players as a gotcha or an annoyance is that it's a trap that players had no way of, right?
Right.
And so in this case, I mean, I think again, I kind of feel bad for chat because this was some of the roles, but there's a couple different options here. Special movement. So this is an obvious one, like I over the trigger. Can I use gaseous form to move through it, or can I just jump over it? There's key or protective items. So maybe there's some kind of item that I could carry with me, and if I have it, the trap doesn't trigger, or I'm immune to its effect. I feel like the one we have here is specific spell use or magical protection, right? Where we're trying to protect the body. We also have specific attribute or skill use. So maybe there's some kind of ability score or class ability like thievery or certain knowledge that the players have to bring to bear that allows them to avoid or resist the trap. And I want to be clear about that. By avoidability, this can also, you know, we become immune to the trap's effect, right? So we're still avoiding it, but it's, you know, we're triggering it, but it doesn't hurt us. We're avoiding it that way. Another option is that a specific class, ancestry, or alignment either doesn't trigger the trap or is immune to it. So I'm thinking you can pass through the portal if you're an elf, but if you pass through as a dwarf, like, you know, that's going to cause problems for you. Or finally, it's a trap where its effect can be turned against enemies or reversed. So maybe the players can do something before the trap is triggered or even after it's triggered to turn it against enemies or reverse its effect. I mean, I feel like we're kind of a combo of 3 and 4 here, where like the way the players avoid the trap is to kind of, you know, do a specific skillful thing or apply a certain magical protection. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? Any of these other ones sort of?
Yeah, I think those are, yeah, I don't think that there's really anything else based on what we've already built or the way that we want this to run that would really be different than I mean, I guess 2 also could kind of come into a little bit because of something like the protective wax that we're or something that we have potentially in there, but that kind of falls into 3 a little bit too. If it's the the grave wax or whatever, then that's already kind of in 3. So yeah, I think those are the ones that make the most sense.
Awesome. So we have telegraphing here, which is another one of the aspects of trap design that's really important. That in general, even if you have one element of the trap visible, either the trigger or the hazard, I think it's still useful to at least have one way that the trap is foreshadowed. So if you want to jump back to the Jamboard and bring us to the very last slide, telegraphing traps.
Okay.
There are 6 kind of broad ways that I do this in my own adventures, where you can basically suggest to the players that a trap is present either in the current area or is coming up, so that they don't feel completely blindsided by it. So an obvious one is physical evidence of the traps. So that could be, the classic example is a corpse in the chamber that suggests, okay, what is the actual trap here? How does it work? Or it could be residue. So I'm thinking gas trap, it leaves residue on the floor. If it's like a lightning bolt trap, maybe there's ozone in the air. But something like that. That's kind of the classic one when people think about telegraphing traps. Another example is a clue elsewhere in the dungeon. And this clue can take a number of forms. It could be maybe like an adventurer's journal that doesn't just straight up say, hey, swinging axe in chamber 3, but it might be a little bit more implicit and say, we lost another companion to the dreadful Hall of Mirrors. Players think, oh shit, what's up with the Hall of Mirrors? And died in there. Could be etchings on the wall. Give a clue that there's a trap elsewhere in the dungeon, that something's being guarded, right? A warning by an NPC. So if you have an NPC that's friendly, maybe you do something for them or trade something valuable to them, they might say, hey, watch out, I heard about, people dying in the Hall of Mirrors, that kind of. We can also place the trap alongside an environmental detail that previously suggested danger. So this one's a bit more of an advanced trick. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but there's a really great book, one of my favorite game design books, called An Architectural Approach to Level Design. It's by Christopher W. Totten, Totten. And he talks a lot about the use of recurring symbols in level design to build up associations between certain environmental details and either positive or negative things. So an example he gives is like the lambda symbol in 2, that when the players encounter it, it's almost always near treasure caches that the rebels have. And so you build up this association as you play the game of, oh, this lambda, this is a safe house, there's treasure nearby. The way that you might do that in a dungeon adventure is you just use the same detail for dangers over and over again. So let's say, okay, at the very beginning of the dungeon, like there's 2 chests, there's a gold and silver one. The gold one's good. Maybe halfway through the dungeon, okay, a silver door. Well, the silver door is trapped and fake. The gold door is the real one. And then later in the dungeon, finally, there's a gold or silver urn. Everything fucked us. So that's a really basic example of what he calls environmental narrative detailing. Very kind of, pro tier stuff, but it's really good. Oh boy. Demonstrate presence on or with a monster or an NPC. We kind of do this with our trap where the players will recognize the helmet from the monster they fought earlier. So they know, oh, okay, these things have bile breath weapon. So we kind of know what we're up against here. But you might also have an NPC or monster actually trigger the trap, either in that channel or elsewhere. To go back to my Dungeon 23 trap called Wolf. And the way it works is that there's these like animal Mesoamerican type dungeon. Like it's based off of Hidden Shrine of Tomoa-chan, this old tournament module. And when creatures move through the hallway, all these animal fish open up and it erupts with such force that boom. But the way the players that trap is telegraphed to them is that when they first get to that hall, a carrion crawler comes down and moves towards them, crosses the hallway, the trap triggers and obliterates the carrion crawler with thunder. And now the players are like, oh shit, we probably need to think about how we get through this. We just saw what happened when a creature goes in. So that's an example. That's also something that Christopher Totten talks about in his book. And then finally, one thing you can do is give the players an ability earlier in the dungeon that foreshadows the presence of that trap. So an example would be they find a scroll early on in the dungeon. And this scroll is a scroll of protection from symbol, right? And the description is that you use this scroll and you can protect yourself from one symbol trap activate. Oh, okay. Well, we look out now for symbol traps. So I apologize for that little mini lecture I ISO'd there, but these are the different ways that I've used, that I've telegraphed traps in my adventure. Ready? We have demonstrate the with a previous monster. We've got those channels, which I fucking love. The channels in the ground. That's going to freak people out as they start making their way. But what I want to do, because I feel bad that we didn't actually roll as much as I thought we would for this trap, it just sort of worked out that way. Why don't we pretend that we're in an alternate world, do a different way of telegraphing, and let's give somebody in the chat an opportunity to.
All right. So what? So we're just gonna roll like on the table that we were just on. The gosh, where is it?
Just roll a d6 on this slide here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, for the telegraphing, yeah. Okay, so someone in chat just roll exclamation point d6. Ooh, we got the first one that came up was a 5. There was a 5 and then a 1 after that.
Gotcha. So we have 5, which is demonstrate presence on or with monster NPC, and you got a 1 as well.
Yep.
So why don't we do a variant of demonstrate? So let's do something similar to what I described with the carrion crawler. So what might we do? Again, this isn't something we would probably use in the module, but let's pretend the universe where we demonstrate the presence of this trap on a monster or an NPC. So the players get an opportunity to see a monster or NPC trigger the trap and suffer its effect. So what might we do here?
For this dungeon, I can imagine, if we already have skeleton, like badass skeleton knight or something earlier in the dungeon, maybe there's like, a low level skeleton guy. And I don't know about this trap specifically, but I can imagine it like walking across a room or something and it just being like, and like something takes it out kind of situation. In here though, I think it would be hard because of the ongoing effect to see it before it happens, I guess.
Let's challenge ourselves, right?
Okay.
That's the fun of design is let's push ourselves and go, okay, so what could we do here if we needed to practice our telegraphing skills to demonstrate this trap's effect on a monster or an NPC. So, for example, what we might do is have maybe a different, smaller version of this trap at a previous chamber. We have the channels, we have faces or helmets in other parts of the dungeon, right? So maybe we get to witness the effect of these sort of helmets, these heads that are on shelves or in walls. And maybe we have something similar to the carrion crawler where the players make it to an area, a monster approaches them, the faces open up and just spit out the bile. Maybe it is a skeleton monster, so we get to see the etching in effect a little bit.
Well, don't we have that though? Like, don't we have like the knight that they fight earlier? Isn't that already demonstrating the presence? Didn't we kind of do this backwards where we then, that was kind of like the clue that this is what the skeleton heads do, and it's demonstrated when it attacks the players, and then they see these knight heads again later in this dungeon? Would that be the same kind of thing, since we already kind of like gave them like, oh shit, like didn't that create the oh no moment?
Yes, but what we're doing here is we're pretending we're in an alternate universe.
Gotcha. Okay. Well then, yeah, I mean that's exactly what I imagine. Then is just like if we had these channels and these like, you know, acid things. If what's gonna go throughout the whole thing is these like skull heads or whatever like that. What if it does like, you know, shoot the acid out onto something beneath it that we're, you know, fighting or something, and etches some rune onto them, and then they actually have like a debuff while we're fighting them or something like that.
And then I think the other person rolled a 1, so that's physical evidence of effect. So that's an easy one. So that could be either a corpse maybe in the chamber, or we have some kind of residue. Like an obvious one would be that you can see like dripping down from the helmets is like the residue of the bile, or it could smell like when they walk in the chamber. I actually don't know what bile smells like, but I imagine it's pleasant.
It's pretty acrid, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've tasted it, but I've never really like sat down and sniffed it. But again, this is another example. Like, you know, we probably wouldn't use this in our actual module, but again, we're kind of practicing. Like, okay, if we had to, this what would. And again, physical evidence can be smell, taste, feeling. Like when you walk into a room, do I feel? You know, do I taste something on my tongue, like that sort of thing? But you know. And one thing I want to really drive home here, to go back to a previous thing we discussed, was this question of, well, do you hide traps or do you not hide? And for me, it's like the answer is yes and no, like both. It's everything, right? Yeah. Like you have some parts of the trap, the trigger or the hazard, and Yora says pick one or the other to hide, keep one hidden, make one visible. And then we also have these telegraphing strategies, which not only help the players feel that rising tension of, okay, there's something dangerous here that we're walking into, but also heads off some of the more common, quote, gotcha trap scenarios where the players feel like they're blindsided from nowhere. I guess that's redundant,
right?
But
I love the hazard visible, trigger not visible. I feel like that feeds into really well with like the oh no or moment, you know, more than like the aha or something like that. Because I feel like oh no is just such a good thing to have in a dungeon, and it's just death traps and stuff like that. It's just be like, I can see the consequences of a bad action or choice I'm probably gonna make. And then it just ramps the tension up a ton. I love the idea of like seeing what could potentially kill you, but not knowing how it could possibly kill you yet.
Exactly right. Like it goes back to the very first role that I listed that traps should play in a dungeon adventure is to create tension at dramatically appropriate moments. You described like that's a big part of the dungeon crawl, is that oh no feeling. And you know, for a lot of people, the approach to that is let me just hide every trap, put traps in places the players wouldn't expect, because again, intuitively that kind of makes sense. Like that's what a dungeon builder would do. But there's a really great quote from that blog post that that I linked that Joris wrote, where he says that as game designers, this is really a people take away, is that as game designers, our goal is not to stop the players as best we can. It's to create interesting challenges for them, right? Because again, like if you were really building a Deathtrap dungeon, you would completely hide your traps, you would clean up any evidence, put them in the most like nondescript hidden area, because that's what you would do. You want to kill or drive off and really build a simulation. We're building a game experience, right? And the hope with the different techniques that I've talked about tonight is that people can start to see how you create that Deathtrap dungeon without necessarily having to completely hide all your traps or put them in nondescript, uninteresting locations that the players would never expect, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, that's what so much of adventure design and dungeon design and stuff like that gets wrong in, especially like 5e and the people that write a lot of those stuff. It's just like it's not a simulation. It's a fun game experience that you're trying to have. Like there's this, I don't know, split in discourse where there's people that I don't understand what games they fucking play, where they basically think that like, it's all about the RP or whatever, and the mechanics and system are just holding it back and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, but that's all solipsistic, right? Like you have to have a system in order to play the game. And I like leading into things like this that feel gamier, that feel like you can gamify the thing a little bit. Like it's this thing that's like you can RP in a board game if you want, and that's a role-playing game, you know what I mean? Like, but without a system, it's difficult to do the inverse of that. So I like when things are little gamier like this and you can gamify a situation, because again, and a lot of it feeds back into the moment that we're trying to produce these memorable, times that, someone can walk away from the table and say, how fucking cool was that? And without a system in place, without a process in order to do that, it would be really difficult, because then you're relying exclusively on every individual person to push every individual aspect of everything. I like this to me is what feels right when, especially doing something like this. So.
Yeah, 100%. And I know that we moved through this kind of quickly, and I've really glossed over some of the finer details about this process. I promise that there will be a lot more of this to come in the future. I can't say exactly what yet, but definitely coming soon. But what I'm hoping, you, Ryan, feel this way, and maybe chat, is, again, like we did with Monsters and the map, and all, we've gone from what could have been an extremely bland basic trap. I mean, with the very beginning of this episode, we had, okay, it's an acid trap and it shoots out of the wall, right? And just by applying these different principles, we have gone from that to, what is this? Like it's the heads of 100 of these knights, and it's foreshadowed from monsters earlier, and there's channels in the etch these random symbols on the bones. I love the bone relay piece. Like it's just what I think is a really interesting, memorable, flavorful trap for a dungeon. And we didn't really, again, we didn't have to do that much work.
No. I mean, again, we didn't even roll on a bunch of the tables, because as we were just iterating the first like 2 or 3 things, we created the whole dungeon and hit all of the things that we were talking about, let me bring this up. Like everything that we were trying to hit, from telegraphing, visibility, location, timing, avoidability, all by pulling in things that we had previously talked about and just rolling on 1 or 2 things like the materials and things like that, and then just letting our previous things, as well as the inspiration that it brought up, just run with it. Like it makes it super easy. And again, I still it's building on the process that we've already done each time. I feel like every time we start something new of this process, it feels familiar, because it's going to be like you've kind of already done this a little bit. This is just a different way. But it's also, we're 7 episodes in, and I feel like every time we do something different, it's just pulling back from the previous stuff. So I don't feel like we went over it too quick at all, because I feel like, this is, we're pulling from so much of what we've already built on, which is just, again, super fun to do.
Oh, absolutely. One other thing I want to make clear to people who may be watching or listening is, Ryan and I are both, we're in the Edgelord world. We want the grimdark stuff. And I can imagine somebody watching this being like, well, I don't want to have like super gory, super over the top traps. And that's legitimate. My hope is, and what I would recommend is, you can still follow this process if you're not making something like super over the top or super gory, or you can just use pieces of this. So you might not push super hard on some of the moments, right? But you might say, hey, you know what? I really like the theming. I really like the materials, decoration, effect, where I'm still just using pretty simple traps, but at least I'm giving them a little flavor. I would definitely recommend, even if you're not doing like black metal dungeon crawls, that you find some value in this process, because the goal again is to help you create engaging, thematic traps that don't feel like hit point taxes or gotchas or any of the other. I'll be honest with you, like, I'm going to ISO here a little bit, Ryan. I'm going to go, but
off.
Part of my reason for doing something like this and some of the other trap like content I have in the pipeline is I want to see more role-playing games put some of the stuff in their in their game master guides. Like, I really want to see. I have a dream one day of opening up like a game master's guide or a referee's manual and seeing really robust, interesting trap design guidelines. And I know there's a big traps book out there. I read a lot of them. Some are better than others, but I really still feel like for most players of RPGs, their only exposure to traps is 1 or 2 pages of here's the dart trap, here's the pit trap, here's a deadfall trap, or buying a module and seeing, a nondescript pit or a scything blade that does 1d8 damage, and they're just like, why do I want this in my,
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly, everything feels like exactly what you said. It's some HP tax, or it's like, roll this to avoid X, or maybe it's interesting and there's a rune that triggers, and that's about fucking it. Like, I don't know. This we have built this, or even like the sarcophagus golem and stuff like that, into the foundation of the adventure itself. It doesn't feel like we just flipped to a page and said, okay, pit trap, let me slap that right here. That sounds good. You know what I mean? Like, it feels feels like there's intent to it, like it's not just like, this is probably a good spot for a trap. Like, it feels like, that the adventure itself is built around it, or incorporates it in a way that affects you for the adventure. It's just, I don't know, it feels better. It doesn't feel tacked on.
That's right. Which I think is another thing that people probably would say about a lot of traps. Is they just feel, I like how you put it, they feel tacked on. They feel like just something that was included just out of tradition, because, it's a dungeon crawl. It should be a pit trap, but, it's not really been mindfully designed. So
I feel like an editor just goes, okay, it needs to be 10 pages long and you have to have a puzzle and 3 traps. Do it, Yeah. And people just go, well, fuck. Okay, well then here's a pit trap. I gotta fit under my word quota or whatever. Like, and then that's just how a lot of them feel, is just that, that they weren't designed to be a part of it, that they were just required to be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, well, you've got to have it in there, because that's what the boss wants, and you don't really think too hard about it. So look at the clock here. What I would like to do is maybe open it up for questions, either from you, Ryan, or from chat. Or if there aren't any questions, we can kind of move on to our preview for next episode and do our plugs. But how's
Yeah.
chat doing? I don't have it up.
Yeah,
So.
well, I feel like one of the things that people ask, and I feel like you've hinted on this a little bit, that there's things in the pipeline. But one of the questions that came up earlier was, is there a place that people are going to be able to find these tables either now or potentially we can't really talk about it.
Yeah, in the future, you'll definitely be able to get this whole process soup to nuts, including the handouts and tables. Can't talk too much about it now, but I can wink here. If you join the storytellingcollective.com newsletter, you'll be the first to know when it.
And plus, I mean, and on top of that, you already have, a number of courses and things like, the moments that we talk about a lot. You have a moments course already out, right? That, that people can really dig into a lot of the aspects that we talk about, because so much of this is really built around, those moments. So if people want to see that already, just go to storytellingcollective.com. It is, I mean, it's in the link above me flashing the whole time. But you'll find a bunch of stuff from Sersa there. And your itch page, if we're talking about just Trap specifically, has the Testament of Malice on it already, right?
Yeah.
That still exists there. So that's a free book of just a bunch of fucking awesome traps to check out there as well. So yeah. Yeah, so I think that's pretty good, and I think time-wise, I think we're pretty good. So what? So this is episode 7. Our goal right now is potentially to just 12. I don't know if we're gonna be able to do all of this on stream. We might have some off-stream stuff, so maybe there's a potential for some, just times we hop in that might not end up being on the podcast, but are just like iterating moments that we might. Hop on stream or whatever, but we have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5 episodes left. What's episode 8 about?
The next episode, we are going to talk about puzzle design. And what we're actually going to do is go back to our risky action from earlier in this episode. We're going to come up with the actual puzzle for how players figure out what they're supposed to do to preserve whatever this Snow White type figure. We're going to talk about what the rock grubs are all about. How do the players know how to preserve what to do? And specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit more about lore-based puzzle design using these logical constructs called syllogisms, and contrast those with what I have been calling checkout line puzzles, right?
Okay.
So that's going to be, we're going to kind of build off of what we came up with today. That'll be episode 8.
Nope. I'm so stoked for that one. The trap's super fun. I mean, we built something that I think is another just walk. This adventure is going to have so many like, oh, but what about that part? Oh, but what about that part moments in it already. And we're only on episode 7. So, right. Stick around, stick with us. And yeah, so, kind of touched on it a little bit already. You are on Storytelling Collective. Your itch is, let me drop the Sersa command here so you can find Sersa's link tree to everything. That's the link.tr/ee or /Sersa Victory. You can find all of your stuff there. I highly recommend anything available that's got Sersa's name on it. You should grab and read and put on your shelf. That's what this entire shelf behind me is. So I very, very, very highly recommend that, you do all of those things. Clearly, if you listen to the course, it sounds like he kind of knows what he's talking about. So maybe, you should do all that. Do you have anything else that you're plugging right now, Sersa?
Not a whole lot. Yeah, on Storytelling Collective, I do have some more RPG design material coming in the near future. I just put out Write Your First Gothic Romance. If you're into writing Gothic fiction, you can jump in that course. And then, if you check out my recent Dungeon 23 modules, there's a lot of examples of me kind of working through this process. I use a lot of examples in today's episode, but you'll see a bunch. And then my plan tomorrow is to drop a free 50+ page adventure for Shadow Dark. It's going to be a conversion of the module that I talked about today, the Lost Caves of the Worm Witch with kind of the Scorpion Temple stuff. So that should be going out tomorrow.
Yeah, and if you're listening and you haven't backed the Shadow Dark RPG, I'd be surprised because it's passed its goal by just a couple 100,000. So you definitely want to go check that out. I think this will be your third adventure already for Shadow Dark, or third.
That's
conversion?
right.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm cheating a little bit because they're conversions, but they are like completely different layout, completely different format. There's some updates to it, so they are definitely their own products. But yeah, that should be the third one. They're all for free on my itch page.
There you go. And then we are the Adventure Archive. This is Seance, our Death Tomb dungeon design stream. You can also find me pretty much every weekend over on the Weekly Scroll podcast, where we interview game creators. We do reviews, which we're going to be getting back to. And you can find all of our links, at theadventurearchive.net. You can find us on Instagram at the.adventure.archive, and you definitely want to check out our YouTube, where you'll find all of these videos, and soon on the podcast, but on YouTube you can find us at the Adventure Archive. We recently passed 700 subscribers, still shooting for 1,000 so we can do more fun stuff. So if you're listening or you're watching, definitely hit that subscribe button. We would appreciate that. And I think that's our episode for tonight. What about you?
I think that's it.
Okay, so tune in next week where we're going to talk about puzzles. And thank you again, everybody in chat. We will see you same time, 7 or 7:30 on Tuesdays for the next at least 5 weeks. And you guys all have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Bye, folks.